Okay. Thank you for your patience. We were really trying to include people remotely. There's just a few connection issues and internet issues, so maybe we'll be able to bring them on, but we thought we'd just go ahead and get started. So just want to introduce myself. My name is Lisa Haggerty. I'm with the Litchfield Park Historical Society. And if you're new to our presentations, we've been partnering with the church at Litchfield Park since 2019, and we were coming up with presentations pretty much monthly, and then COVID hit, so things kind of slowed down. But we're very excited to work with the church and certainly thank all the church staff and everyone who's helped us make this possible and bring the presentation back. Following the presentation, we should have some time for question and answer. So if you have any questions that pop up, we'll allow some time for that. And with that, I think I'll just take a moment and introduce our speakers. So, oh good. Looks like our Zoom is working, at least for the moment. And hopefully they'll be able to hear us and be able to see what's going on here shortly. So, all right, so our speaker this evening is Steve Renzi, a University of Arizona graduate with a degree in history, who believes that every generation must learn about who and what came before them, or else the lessons learned are lost. As a writer and photographer with a teaching certificate in secondary education, Mr. Renzi is always searching for new ways of exploring art history. He has been published in over 200 magazine and newspaper articles and is currently a writing and photography teacher as well. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Renzi.
Now I'm unmuted.
Can everyone hear me? Microphone works good? Okay. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for coming. This is a good story. It's a good history story, and it doesn't go way, way back, so it's kind of modern. As a matter of fact, at the end of it, we'll do questions, and every time I give this talk, everybody always, a lot of people relate their own stories of German POWs. They had contacts with them when they were children or a little bit older, so it's kind of, it's an interesting story, and it's a good part of history that a lot of people, well, let me ask you this, how many people have heard of this before? Okay. Well, I'm like you probably, I heard of it, but I didn't know any, like a year or two, I didn't know any details, so I just read about it one time, a little blurb about it, and I go, that's interesting. And then I started reading more about it, and I got into it, and there was only one book actually published about it in the 60s. So I read that book. And then I was going to write a book myself about it, because it's so interesting, but unfortunately a guy beat me to it, so he came out in last year. But it's a good book, so I would recommend it. It's called The Great Desert Escape. I call mine Arizona's Great Escape. What it is it's the largest POW escape during World War II in United States history. And another very interesting part about this story, to me, so interesting, was that all these guys that escaped, all the German POWs, not all of them, but the vast majority of them were submariners. So that took the story in a whole different level for me, and I learned all about U-boat men and things like that. So that was fascinating to me. Another question I'm going to ask you is if there's any veterans, you don't have to answer now, but if anyone has served on a submarine as a veteran, and women do it too, but it's mostly men, I would like to get your email after this. So I've done this talk. It was scheduled 20 times. It's a very popular talk, actually. And then COVID hit, and so just crashed. So I haven't done it since last year. I did 13 or 14 of them, so I got the hang of it, but I haven't done it since, I guess it was March, right, when COVID hit. So I got my notes here. I might have to look at my notes once in a while just to refresh my own memory. I'll skip that part. Okay, here's the story. On December 23rd, okay, the night of December 23rd, pouring down rain in Phoenix, Papago Park, which is at 64th and McDowell. You guys probably know where that is. Not very far from here. Although they tore down every remnant of the camp, there is a historical marker, that's it. Okay, so December 23rd, that night, pouring down rain. It was, remember rain? You probably remember, we used to, what's that? 1944, good question. 1944, okay. So, the last part of World War II, actually. So, December 23rd, the night, 25 men got knapsacks, and they left down a hole that they had spent 4 months digging at Papago Park prisoner of war camp, and they escaped through a tunnel. So it actually happened the 23rd until the morning of Christmas Eve, the 24th, okay, because it took them several hours. It was a very small tunnel. It was only like 36 inches by, you know, pretty small, because they had to dig through caliche soil. I'll talk a little bit about that more. But, so they left in 2s and 3s. They didn't all leave it as a group. They left in groups of 2s and 3s. Okay, so it was about 178 foot, almost 200 foot tunnel. They started in August, it was completed in December. They were waiting for the right time. Well, the right time was they had smuggled up, Germans were ingenious, okay, so they had created their own radio in the camp. So they were aware of the news, they knew what was going on. Well, there was a German counteroffensive in France, or Belgium area, I think it was Belgium, we later called it the Battle of the Bulge. You know about that. But, so they knew the Germans were coming back, so the whole camp, there's 2,000 people in Papago Park, prisoner of war camp. It was the largest prisoner of war camp in Arizona. Florence might have been equal, but it was, if not the largest, nearly the largest. Okay, so there's 2,000 POWs, so they were all hooting and hollering, making a ruckus. They even had smuggled beer in there, so they were drinking alcohol even. Okay, so the Americans sent guards with wooden clubs to break it up. Okay, so when they did that, the Germans, these POWs, the submariners, either way, not all of them, but most of them, snuck out. So they used that disturbance to sneak out. Okay, so once they get out, they had found maps. They used to go on work details, and sometimes they would find things in the trash. Well, a couple times they found maps, you know, Arizona maps, probably in magazines or something. So they had an idea where they were, where to go. So they went out, okay, and they all split up. They went different directions, but they all headed south, almost all of them. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So they put the North Star on their backs, they traveled at night, and they headed out. So the Americans did not do a roll call because it was Christmas Eve. See, they left Saturday night. They had planned this way ahead. So they knew that on Sunday afternoons, the American military officials, prison guards, would usually do a roll call first thing in the morning and then at 4 p.m. But on Sundays, they let the prisoners sleep in, I guess, or just was more casual. So they didn't do a roll call till 4 p.m., Christmas Eve, 1944. So when they did that roll call, 25 names were unanswered. So they had dug a hole, the Germans, and they had covered it up. So the Americans did not even know how they got out. So this was just the first search underway. I think this came out on Christmas. This is, I think the Phoenix Gazette or the Arizona Republic, one of those. And the colonel of the American, the prison camp official, he thought that the Germans scaled the fence. They had 2 double 8-foot tall barbed wire fences, and he thought that the Germans had somehow scaled those fences. They did not discover a tunnel until 3 or 4 days later. Okay, so that's the Phoenix Gazette. So they're still on the loose, okay? That gives you a date. He's going to be important, that guy, so just remember. He's the leader, I'll just tell you right now. Captain Jürgen Wattenberg, okay, he was the leader. He was a naval officer on the Kraft Spee, which was their German battleship, big battleship, okay? And then he became a submarine commander, but he was the #1 guy of the camp and of the escape attempt. Okay, now what other interesting part of this story that I learned about and what got me interested was, I'm from Delaware, I grew up in Delaware. Okay, this painting, I'll give you a close-up of it. It's been hanging in my mom's parents' house for 40 to 50 years. And one day I asked my mom, where'd that painting come from? And she goes, a German POW had painted it and gave it to her. So I had my own POW story. And so what it says, and I should have done a close-up, but it says Bogle Farm, B-O-G-L-E. That's either Boggle or Bogle, not sure. Farm, New Mexico. Okay, well they were from Delaware, but the Americans had sent the Africa Corps. You guys know your history. Some of you know that the Africa Corps in North Africa were part of, I think it was Rommel's troops. They sent them to Delaware, the PO camp. So a lot of those guys were pretty educated people, a lot of officers and things like that. So, but I think they first sent this group to New Mexico because I Googled that name, the Bogle Farm, and it's actually a working farm even to this day, and they used German POWs during the war. So that painting, so my mom was a 16-year-old red-haired girl, and she used to work in my grandfather worked in the POW, it was called Fort DuPont. He worked in the gas station there, pumping gas, and the Germans, very lax security. That's one thing they learned about this was the Americans had very lax security. So at Fort DuPont, the Germans actually drove trucks by themselves, believe it or not. And in Arizona, the German officers were allowed to ride horses through the desert. You compare how they treated prisoners to how the Americans treated prisoners. Very different. We changed that towards the end of the war after we found out about concentration camps and things like that. I don't think the American public and even most military officials really knew that story until we started liberating those places. So this guy helped my grandfather pump gas. He worked in a gas station with my grandfather. And I guess my mom would come home from after school and go visit. So we got to know her. Okay, so I'm from Delaware. These guys were submariners, that's why I'm talking about this. Well, I didn't even know the story of these. These towers are along the coast of the Atlantic coast. It's from the Delaware Bay area. I knew they were connected with World War II, but I didn't know. That's how big they are. So they're still there. This is a modern photo. Look at the size of them. I didn't really know what they were. Well, it turns out they were submarine spotters. That's what they were. They were used to triangulate. Here's what happened. When we were attacked in World War II, in Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, December 7th, 1941, the Germans declared war on us December 11th, a few days later. It's actually a surprise to Germany that Japan attacked the United States. They weren't even aware of that. Okay, a lot of people know the Pacific War, we weren't ready for it. We weren't ready for a Pacific War. It's kind of a little bit unknown in history that we were not ready for an Atlantic War either. And so the Germans sent submarines. Their admiral, Karl Dönitz, I think that's how you pronounce it, wanted to send 20 subs across the ocean and line the American coast, okay? And luckily for us, Hitler said, no, we need those subs in Northern Europe, especially the Norway area. So he said, we're only going to send 5. Thank God for that, because those 5 did so much damage to American shipping, it's unbelievable. Matter of fact, later they sent 8 and they expanded their area to the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. It's really not known, but they sank over 400 ships. The German subs sank over 400 ships. So I went back there this summer and checked all this stuff out, and I wanted to learn, because there is a Fort Miles, it's called Fort Miles in Delaware. It was a coastal, it was ready for coastal war. Well, here's a mistake that we made. So we had these guns. They were actually, this is kind of a replica because the actual guns were buried in the sand, and then they were like in bunkers, and then they had a slot. So they were well fortified, but they were big. They were 16 inches, and the inches is the width of the barrel. That's how they measure that. So we had these lining the coast, okay? Delaware Bay was important because it was a lot of shipping and a lot of oil tankers would go across there, around there. So we were prepared for big battleships to come to the coast, okay? And then those towers would triangulate, okay? And then so that when the guy gave the talk about these ships, these things could fire for 24 miles. I mean, it was still a visual war. Radar was developing, but a lot of, especially in naval warfare, was still visual, was sight. So, but they could spot a ship over the horizon 24 miles and shoot. And then the guide said, what do you think the accuracy rate was? And I said, oh, 30%. He said, no, it was 90%. They were very, very accurate. But big battleships isn't what showed up. What showed up was underwater submarines with a periscope that they never saw. Okay, so that's what showed up. So these subs, 5 subs, would line the coast from Cape Hatteras, South Carolina, to like St. Lawrence Seaway. And they would wait in the daytime far off the coast, and then at night they just come in. And they could come in so close, they could come in within 30 feet, shallow depth of water, okay? And so they would just wait. And the Americans, we left our lights on. So in the cities left their lights on. And so the tankers, they would come individually. Our merchant ships would come individually. And so they would just be silhouetted. You know, you can imagine my shadow here. And so the subs would just wait and just pick them off. I mean, they were defenseless. So they sank. And it was winter time, too. So the war was declared December 11th. So they were there January, you know, so the cold of the winter. So when it's horrible warfare because it's almost like video game warfare. So the submarines, they're like 1,000 yards away. So they just shoot torpedoes. And then they just see an explosion and then just a sinking. And so they don't really think of, well, it's warfare, it's cruel, but they weren't thinking of, they didn't target passenger ships. You know, the Germans did not. But unfortunately, at night, sometimes mistakes were made. So sometimes passenger ships were hit. And if you didn't get in the light, some of these ships sank like within a minute or two. So you can imagine, at night, everyone's sleeping except the crew, bare minimum crew. Torpedo hits, it could explode the engine room or sink, and it sinks in 2 minutes, and these people, a lot of them civilians, they're totally unprepared for that. So in the ocean water, you die within minutes. And in fact, there's stories of people in a lifeboat. This is the Atlantic Ocean, and you would think, oh, they're not far from shore. But this is before radar and cell phones and things like that. So a lot of them were lost at sea. So they found people. Here's one story. They found a group of passengers, civilians, and the mother was with her daughter, young daughter, and the mother had died, frozen to death. So the other passengers propped her body up so the daughter would not know that she had died. I mean, so that just shows what warfare was like. And then there's other stories of, you know, being lost at sea, and then they found, I think one ship they found, lifeboat, everybody had frozen to death because it was a cold Atlantic. Okay, let me go back here. So Roosevelt called the subs the rattlesnakes of the Atlantic. I always thought that was a great expression. And they called themselves sea wolves. And they have a unique culture in that they travel alone. I mean, they would group together in groups a lot of times to shoot more than one ship. But a lot of times submarine warfare was just a lone sub. It's a tube within a tube. It's 35 to 40 men. They're in their own world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But so they traveled alone, and when they spotted a ship, it was their decision, you know, to strike it or not. So they had a lot of individual, like, I guess, power to determine who lives and who dies, really. Okay, so here's another, well, this is sub. That's not actually a U-boat, but I couldn't find a picture that I could use, so I just put that. But the German subs were powered by electric power and diesel power. And so electric power is when they went underwater. So here's another thing I learned about World War II submarines, is that they were mostly surface vessels. They were not underwater vessels, because the electric power would only last like 4 hours, maybe 6 at the most, and they went a lot slower. So the submarines, actually, most of the time were on the surface, but they were very low, okay? So they could hide within the waves, and so they would wait at night a lot of times to attack, or they'd wait for fog or something like that, or they'd literally sneak up within waves, you know, that's how they did it. So they were mostly surface vessels. And during World War II, that changed as the war progressed, but by then it was too late for them. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so German humor, they called it the happy time. Okay, it was like sitting ducks. The Americans were like sitting ducks, the ships. And they called it the American shooting season. I mean, it was just so easy because we were not prepared for them. But we evolved and changed, and I'll talk about that. Now, why am I talking about this? Because the German POWs who escaped from the prison camp most of them submariners, and all the officers were submariners. And why were they in Arizona? Because when they were captured, which actually turned out to be fortunate for them, they moved them to Arizona, so they wanted them as far away from the ocean as possible. Okay, so that's just a contemporary, I think that's New York Daily News. But I didn't know any of that. I know a lot about history. I didn't know hardly any of this story, so it was interesting to me to find out, because everybody kind of knows about the Pacific War and naval warfare and things like that. I did not know about this German warfare, and I even lived along in that area of the country. Okay, that just shows like they're more surface, so they're more surface vessels, and they did most of their attacking from the surface. And what they went underwater for, let's see what my next slide is. I'm just trying to get my, oh, it's nothing. Okay, oh, I don't want to jump ahead. Oh, you know what? I won't bother you with this, but this was a YouTube clip. I'll just describe it. So this is a YouTube clip. It's on YouTube, and it's called U-Boat offset in New York Harbor, 1943. So it's an actual, they had German cameras. It's about a minute and a half or something. And it shows this German U-boat surfacing in New York Harbor, and you can see the skyline of New York, Chrysler Building and all that. And they were right in New York Harbor, and we were not even aware of it. I mean, that just shows that, yeah, so they surfaced right in New York Harbor, and they watched movies, and they loved American movies, so they knew all the skyline and all that. But that's how, and it was at night. See, they were just there. They could get there at night. And so they targeted oil. Here's another interesting story I learned, was they targeted oil tankers. Because they targeted merchant ships and oil tankers, but they really looked after oil tankers. And so when they blew those things up, it would just be a tremendous explosion, bright fireball, almost like an atomic mushroom cloud. Not quite, but almost. You know, you can imagine a fuel oil tank. And it would, the whole coastline, people that lived along the coast would see this and hear this, and it was demoralizing for the American public to witness this. But here's can-do American spirit, is that the Americans in the winter of 42, were in danger of running out of heating oil. They had blown up so many oil tankers, the Germans did, the U-boats did, that our country was in danger of running out of heating oil for the Northeast. That's New York, that's Philadelphia, that's Boston, and they still use heating oil today. I mean, that's what they use to heat. So we had to prepare for that, because the next winter, if things were going like that, then it might, you know, they might run out of heating oil. So what they did, the Americans, and this is an unknown story, kind of a construction story, they built a pipeline from Texas to New Jersey. I mean, you can just picture it in your mind what they had to go through: Appalachian Mountains, Mississippi River, swamps, backyards, neighborhoods, and they did it in less than a year. So it was the longest pipeline in the world at that time. And they did two of them. One's called the Big Inch Pipeline, which was oil, and the other one was natural gas. And we did it in less than a year. So I just think that's an amazing story. So, okay, life on a submarine. I'll talk a little bit about this. Let me check my notes real quick. Okay, so 35 to 45 men lived on a sub. So they ate together, they slept together, they got to know each other. I mean, these beds were actually in a torpedo room, so they'd like go like that, and then at night they'd go down like that. So there's no privacy. Everyone sort of dresses alike. This is a World War II children's book of Americans, but German and the Americans were very, very similar. So it's a very contained world, and they were independent. And so when they were out in the sea, they were on their own pretty much, on their own. So they became very, very close-knit. I guess that's the meaning of this story. And I think that's pretty much why these guys were the only Germans to escape and do what they did. So they become very, very close-knit group. Because, to be honest with you, by the end of the war, 80% of those Germans died. It was the largest casualty rate of all their armed forces. Matter of fact, they still kept doing it. They still kept going, and they didn't have desertions and things like that. Matter of fact, the lifespan of a German submarine launched during the end of the war was 40 days. And they knew it too, because the Americans, English, I'll talk a little bit about technology that we developed, but they would just wait for them. And they still went out, these guys. It was almost like kamikazes. I mean, and we don't really appreciate that, but yeah, 80. So it was very fortunate actually to be captured. They didn't realize it at the time, but it was. And the commander, it was egalitarian too. I guess it's not quite a democracy, but almost. So, because the commander, they all dressed similar. And I have a picture of a commander later, I'll show you. So submarine culture. So I actually interviewed this guy that served in the modern day, but I'll tell you some of the things he told me because they were so interesting, and I wrote them down. And his name was Robert Clark, and he served on a nuclear submarine for 35 years, so a contemporary submarine commander. But when he gets recruits, I just love this quote, and I'll read it, but you guys can read it too. "We are not going to run this operation on fear, but if you don't do your job, we will die." So he tells that to every crew member of the sub. That's how important it is. Nobody can slack off. Everybody's got to do their job. Everybody's got to know how the whole machine operates. And it's like that from a nuclear sub to this time period of World War II. So in other words, your life, the life of every person on that crew is dependent on each other. So you can imagine how close. And it's also service over self. You know, you're just one of the group, and they call it the silent service. Okay, what do you think the average age of a submariner was? And this is the U.S. Army, but what do you think the average age was of the U.S. Army submariner in World War II?
20.
What'd you say?
20.
That's pretty good. 19. Well, they were young, so these guys were young. So what did you guys guess? 19? Yeah, that to me, very young. You know, you can imagine fighting war and being 19 years old, and they had really speeded up training. Now, nowadays it takes you 2 years to get, it's called a dolphin pin, where you're a submariner. I mean, you probably go out more, you know, but the 2 years, those guys probably, it was months, and they were out fighting war. Okay, so I love that quote, and then I asked him, okay, what was submarine warfare? What's it like? Okay, he said this quote, I'm gonna read this word for word, I love it. He goes, just imagine, and you're in a pitch dark room, you and your enemy carry bats, and the first one to make a noise loses. Okay, so that's how intense it is. That's how intense submarine warfare is, you know. Very intense. So here's what's interesting about also military submariners, is that it's very egalitarian. He's a commander, they're around the periscope, okay, they're selecting a target to hit. It's not, okay, I'm the commander, I order this, everybody, you do what I say. He goes, no, that's not how it operates. There's a crew, you know, there's officers and even enlisted men around there. Everybody puts their opinion in. Okay, will this work? You know, he asks everyone's opinion. Okay, so it's like a team thing. Because not only do you have to determine what your target is, but very important in submarine warfare, you have to figure out how you're going to get out of there. The escape is very important, okay? Because, especially in World War II, they could travel like 14 to 22 knots on the surface, but underwater, they could only go like 10 to 12 knots. So they were much slower underwater. So they were harder to detect, but they were much slower to get away. So the Americans, this is American warfare, we actually snuck in, it's almost another untold story of World War II. We snuck in a lot to the Japanese harbors and did a lot of damage and then got out. You know, so we did that. But the Germans, here's one famous story of U-boat I think it's U-47. I'll just say this quickly. The English had parked in the Norway fjords. I think that's how you say that word. Very steep, rocky coastline, very deep, you know, very quickly. And so they had parked a warship in there. So they thought, oh, and they had, you know, guards and planes and other boats surrounded it, and netting, underwater netting and things like that. Well, this one German sub took 3 days, and it would surface, go down, and wait all day long. During the daytime, surface at night, and it took them 3 days. In fact, one time they were so close to the coast that a car came and was just headlights from a car and lit them up. and they thought they were exposed from, you know, Army tanks or whatever, and it was just cars, and the cars never saw them, and I guess turned off the road. That's how close to the shore they were. So they torpedoed the Royal Oak and sank it. Okay, it was a big deal. This guy became a hero in Germany. And then they had to wait a day or two to get out of there, and they didn't know how it was sunk, so they thought it was spies or somebody snuck in and blew it up. They never realized it was a German U-boat that snuck in there and got them. Okay, these are captured U-boat men. Let me talk a little bit about, before I go to those guys, well, I'll just leave it up there. They're a little bit older, you can tell, but they've probably been serving in the warfare for 3 or 4 years now. It was a very highly respected position to be a U-boat man in Germany during that time. Very highly respected. These guys were captured in Delaware, actually, Lewis, Delaware, and so when I went to that, I'll show you the commander. The commander, he looks like a movie guy. He looks pretty evil. They actually said he was a nice guy, but he looks kind of evil. But then you see how he dressed? He's not distinguishing from any. So they were very egalitarian in their dress, and even the Germans were. He's a commander. Well, here's another warfare story about German submarines or submarine warfare. So they launched the torpedoes and sank merchant ships. Well, what did they? Well, I'll just say it. So then they had to wait for this. Well, what the Americans did was we learned not to travel sink by themselves. They learned to convoy up, okay? So they had groups of, say, 20 merchant ships. They turned all the lights off. We learned to do that. We also had destroyers, okay, around. They were like sheepdogs, okay, or wolf dogs, or you know what I mean? So the Germans would strike, but then the destroyers would come after them. And they had sonar. They didn't have quite developed radar yet. It was coming though. But they had sonar, which was that pinging sound, ping, ping. And so it would bounce off. So then the Germans would turn and try to get away. Oh, they tried to get away. Well, the destroyers were faster, so they then had to sink down. So there's one story. This one German sub sank and just laid on the ocean floor. Okay, and the destroyers were prowling above them, and they knew kind of where they were, and they dropped these depth charges. You guys heard of those, okay? They dropped 127 depth charges. One could destroy the whole ship. You can imagine how nerve-wracking that is. So they dropped 127. They couldn't locate it, but they kind of knew where it was. These guys had to just sit in perfect quiet, because if you dropped a fork or a plate or something, you expose yourself. You couldn't even talk. They didn't even go to the bathroom. I just learned this. I don't know if they peed. I'll say peed in cans, or then the other one. They couldn't flush the toilet. They couldn't go to the bathroom. They couldn't close the door. They couldn't give themselves away. So this thing was traveling for 8 hours and dropping depth charges, and the commander, trying to calm everybody down, got a book and just started reading. And the men, you know, they're all looking at each other. You saw that picture, how close-knit they are. You know, they're all together. And they noticed that the commander had the book upside down the whole time and never turned a page. So he was as nervous as everybody, but he didn't want to show it. And they lived, because that's how we know that story. Most of them did not live. And they knew they had struck at the Americans when the oil would come up, or debris. And sometimes the Germans would release oil, but it wouldn't, try to fake them out. But that's how they knew the Americans would quit, when they saw that oil slick. Okay, so we had destroyers. By the summer of 1943, no more subs along the American coast. Luckily, they didn't send it 20, like they could have. They only sent 5. Later, they increased it to 8, but they also increased their area. But they did a lot of damage, as I said. But why did they leave by the summer of 1943? One reason was the convoys. We did that. Another was the destroyers. But another one, which was very fortunate for us, was the Civil Air Patrol was created on December 3rd, 1941, right before December 7th, 4 days before. The Civil Air Patrol was civilians that would fly their own planes, but they could spot. The Germans, like I said, the submarines were surface vessels. They're very, very vulnerable to air attack. That's their Achilles heel, I guess you would say, was the airplane bombing, okay? They had 20 to 30 seconds. It was all visual. So they'd be in that conning tower, you know, with binoculars, looking for targets, but also listening and looking up in the sky. And if they saw a plane, they couldn't say, well, is that a warplane or a civilian? They didn't take a chance. They dove, because they had 20 to 30 seconds. And when they dove, their stern end would stand up, so they're very vulnerable right there. So if a plane could be on them in 20 or 30 seconds, it would drop a bomb and is danger of sinking the sub. So the Civil Air Patrol disrupted them, you know, because they were, and it was men and women. I don't think the women did submarine patrol. I don't know, but they did fly. I know the women did fly, but the people used their own planes, which was very interesting. And then here's a funny story. There's that one in Florida, one sub dove and sank, and it was in shallow water, and its ass end, I guess you would say, was sticking up out of the water for 45 minutes. And they kept radioing in, it's exposed, come get it. And no one ever got it. And so then they said, we're going to start carrying bombs. So these planes had a big bomb, 500-pound bomb. It was probably hard to take off of that thing, that they'd pull with a string and drop it. And I don't think it ever worked, but it was just enough to scare the Germans enough. So it was Civil Air Patrol kind of helped disrupt the submarines. And also blimps. Here's something I learned too. We started using blimps, and if you think, if it's still visual, imagine what the view of a blimp could be, you know, as far as spotting, you know. So they use blimps, and they actually have rocket launchers on these guys, and they would shoot rockets down at them. And if nothing else, it just disrupted the subs. They couldn't sneak up as much. But the main thing, I don't think I have a picture of it. Okay, there's destroyed subs. The main thing was radar, the development of radar. Okay, the radar got more sophisticated, and we could put radar on airplanes, and they couldn't hide in the darkness anymore. That was the main thing. So, and then they were very vulnerable to air, so airplanes would just patrol, and when they would see the subs, they'd go after it. And they couldn't hide in the darkness, or they couldn't hide in the fog. And like I said before, they weren't underwater. They weren't, you know, they were more surface vessels, so it took them 30 seconds to dive underwater. So they became very vulnerable. And these are destroyed subs. I think this is in France. But here's an interesting picture I just thought, was that this is where once they got in there, they would go in, and look at this. This thing has probably been bombed 1,000 times, and look at it. That was after the war. It looks totally undamaged. So once they got in there, they were good. So so they had submarine ports in southern France. That's the ones that came to America. So when D-Day, another thing about D-Day that people don't realize is it took away those ports. So then they had to go all the way around to the North Atlantic to like where Germany is. You know, I think Germany has a little bit of sea coast. And boy, the English would just wait for them there because they knew they had a lane that they had to go through. And so that's another reason they lost like 80% of their men. But once they got in there, and they had parades for them, and I read a book called Iron Coffins. And it was another commander, a German commander who survived, talked about the war. And he said, it was funny, in the first parts of the war, you know, they had parades, and, you know, women would bring them flowers, and there would be 1,000 people lining these things and you know, celebrating them. And then as the war progressed, less and less and less. And so by the end of the war, no one would show up. So they'd show up, you know, and then they'd have a meal, and then like 2 weeks off, and then they're out to sea again. So it's just kind of funny how the celebrations and things deteriorated as the war progressed. So they did not want to be captured by the Russians. So this just shows, what do you think the fatality rate of Russian German POWs captured by the Russians would be? What would you guess? He said, yeah, 90%. So they did not want to be captured by the Russians. So they would surrender en masse to the Westerns. So this is Germans surrendering. I don't know where this picture is, but I wanted to make that point about the Russians. They did not want, but there is something called the law of the sea. here's an interesting story. Law of the sea, and even in World War II, I don't think the Japanese did follow it. I'll have to do more research on this. But if a victor sinks a ship, the law of the sea, maritime law, going way, way, way back, is you're supposed to pick up survivors, okay? And the Americans did that, and the English did that, and I think the Germans did it when they had ships, but the submarines could not do it, so they could not observe the law of the sea, because they had no room. So there is no real atrocities committed by the there is one, actually, where they shot survivors. That was the only one time they did that. But they could not observe the law of the sea, that the submarines could not. Okay, so sometimes they would disable a sub, and luckily for the sub, it would surface, okay, and there would be survivors, and that's the people who were captured, the submariners who were captured. So they would take them in, they would interrogate them, big interrogation, and then they would put them on a train and take them to Arizona. That's where they sent them. So this is, these are men being transported along the train. So here's we got this from letters and things that they said. Well, first things that they noticed. First of all, you could always tell the submariners because they had pale skin, no sunlight. So the Americans could spot them instantly because Africa Corps guys and all that would be deeply bronzed, in the desert sun. And the submariners were always white as ghosts, translucent skin. So they were easy to pick out. So when they got on the train, they were allowed to sit down. Okay, so they've been propagandized their whole life. A lot of them were Hitler Youth and things like that, or just growing up in that society. So when they traveled in their own troop transports, they had to stand up in boxcars. So they were allowed to sit down. So that was a little bit, so things were starting to change in their mind. Then they were served coffee and sandwiches. We served them coffee and sandwiches on the trip. And we also, they had porters, black porters. They had seen blacks before, but not too many, so we had black porters. And here's a story that I learned, which was, like, we have a sense of fairness, and like today we're going, how can we do this? But the Germans would go into like a town or something, and then they would, get off and feed at like the diner or whatever, not a diner, but a depot. Well, we made the American black servicemen even, go into the back door, and the German POWs would sit down, and we didn't allow. So, I mean, that was outrageous. And Thurgood Marshall, actually, that's a famous thing that was one of the cases. It was a very famous story, and it's been forgotten in history. And I just learned about it by researching this. Is that there was an incident, where we served German prisoners, allowed them to sit, and our own American soldiers, we didn't allow them to sit, and they had to go in the back to eat. So that was a very famous story at that time. It's been forgotten in our own history. So these guys, first of all, they noticed how big the country was. It was just gigantic, so that surprised them, because they were going all the way across the country. Another thing they learned was how many cars, they love cars just like Americans, how many cars Americans had. They were very surprised. Another thing is, they thought that the trains was deliberately avoiding all the bombed out areas in America, because from their news, from their propaganda, they had thought that the German Luftwaffe was doing a lot of damage to America. So they thought there was craters everywhere in bombed out cities in America. And so they thought that the plane was deliberately, not the plane, but the train was deliberately avoiding those areas. Okay, so we'll talk about, so they became prisoners of war. And so the Kriegsmarine was the German Navy, and they sent those people to Papago Park, which was in Arizona. And there was 500 POW camps in the United States. There was like almost 500,000 prisoners of war. They tried to put the Italians and the Germans together. It didn't work. The Germans would either beat them up, or they didn't like them. They didn't like each other, so they could not house them together. So you almost never see Germans and Italians housed together. And that's happened in Arizona also. And so there's like 18 of them, and I learned that there was one in here at Litchfield Park. Is that true? Yeah. So there's one here, and there's 18 all throughout Arizona. And that's I believe that's Florence. That's the one in Florence. The aerial shot of it. Oh, no. Yeah, I think it is Florence because it doesn't have here's Papago Park. So this is the one in Papago Park. This is contemporary, and nothing, one shame about all this is they tore everything down. So there's nothing really left of all, and they didn't have a sense of preserving any of that. But these guys had painting classes and art classes, and one in Florence had its own newspaper. And it was interesting, actually, to learn this. Okay, so they came to, let's see where we're at. Okay, let's not jump ahead. Okay, let's go there. Well, you know about cotton. I guess it's a cotton community too, because I saw cotton fields on the way here. Well, that's what the German prisoners would do. They became a valuable economic asset because all the men were all fighting war, most of the men, and so we needed somebody to do the agricultural work. So that's what they did in Delaware, where I'm from, and they did that out here, and they picked cotton, and they were required to pick 80 pounds a day, which actually, compared to professional cotton pickers, like 300 pounds, I've read, they picked 300 pounds or so. These guys were only required to pick, 100 pounds it was, and they were paid 80 cents a day, so we even paid them to do that. So they picked cotton. And it's sharp. You probably know this more than me, but it has sharp barbs on it, so it's hard work, and you have to learn to get under it and pull it down. And the really experienced ones would do 2 rows at a time, but the amateurs, would do 1 at a time. And so it's hard work, as you can guess, do it manually. And I just like this. You've probably seen this. Some communities that I go to, they've never seen anything like this. This is a modern day one. So it can do 6 rows at a time, and this can do the work of 500 people. So when it was interesting, I wrote something about cotton and the history of cotton, things like that. And when they were first introduced in this area, the mechanical ones, of course, it put people out of work. They didn't want them. So the primitive ones, I think it was late 40s, early 50s, could do 1 or 2 rows at a time. And the workers would drive metal stakes in the ground to try to damage it. So one guy interviewed the guy who did the very first cotton picker, I think it was in Florence. And he said he had to lock it up at night because they would damage it, and not guard it, but almost guard it, probably had dogs. And then he also had to have somebody walk in front of the machine to check for iron spikes. Okay, so this is World War II, as we all know, was not a 1% war. I think you might know what Afghanistan, Iraq, 1% of the population is involved and has people that die, and 95% of the people go on their lives like nothing. Well, the whole society was involved in World War II. I think you all know that. But so I just grabbed a few things from the time period just to show you that. You probably know all this, but I'll just refresh. Oh. There it goes. Oh, I went ahead. Go back. Oh. So anyway, buy war bonds, sell your car, cash in 5 minutes. And I didn't know I was coming here, but there you go. Goodyear aircraft car. Men and women, so a lot of women got work, and a lot of minorities got work, and so economic opportunities. Does that place still exist today? Goodyear Aircraft Corporation? They were hiring a lot of, it's 500, 220 West Jefferson. Kids were involved in the war, colored book, that's 1944 colored book. I love the graphics on that. War bonds, they would have thousands of people, celebrities would help out, war bonds, buying war bonds. And also, I always like this, because I'm a fan of this, is music. How many songs are about Afghanistan and Iraq? I can't think of any, or if there isn't, they're not popular. Whereas it was part of our music, a lot of songs dealt with the war, talked about the war. Tex Ritter, I like that one up there. Cowboy, singing cowboy. Okay, so by 1944, we were tired of war. The whole country was tired of war. When will it end? Let's see where we're at here. Okay, so this is a contemporary. We were getting closer to Germany. We were bringing the fire to Germany, but back in Arizona. So Papago Park prisoner of war camp. They were using the men to dig cotton, to pick cotton. Okay, So they had a few troubles. So they had a new commander come in August of 1944. His name was William Holden. And he said that because we had some trouble, we're going to house all the unrepentant Nazis, they called them, and the incorrigibles into one compound, and they called it Compound 1A. So they did that, and they made a mistake on that because they thought it would be a punishment. They thought the prisoners would view it as a punishment, but actually the prisoners viewed it as a chance to scheme and plot, is what they did. So they began digging at, so another kind of funny story is he took a bunch of officials around public Phoenix people and he tapped on the ground with a stick, walking stick, and he said, this ground is much too hard to dig in through. No one will ever dig through it. And he pounded it real hard, caliche soil. And the Germans were like snickering because he said that because they had double barbed wire fence surrounding the camp, and to put the post holes in the ground, they had to blow a hole using dynamite. So that's how hard the soil is. You guys know how hard the soil is out here. They thought nobody would ever dig a tunnel. Well, one thing that happened was the year of 1944 was a very rainy year. So probably, I was just thinking about that, probably loosened the soil up a little bit. So on August 1944, they started digging. And what they did is they had a wash house. They noticed, you ever seen that movie, The Great Escape with Steve McQueen? They found the blind spot, okay? So there was one spot in there near the wash house where the guards could not see what they were doing. So they started digging there. And near the wash house, they used to do their laundry, so they would hang their sheets around, their clothes. And it also further concealed what they were doing. And they would work at night. So they started digging on August. So they went 6 feet down, and then they saw where the fence was, and they went straight for it. And then there was a canal close to the fence, but just far enough away, so they made sure they didn't dig into the canal, because the canal had water in it, and it would flood the whole tunnel, so they had to watch for that too. So they started digging, so it took them 4 months. They had tin cans, one shovel for coal, because they had a coal stove to heat the place, and then they were bare hands. That's how they started. So they started digging. So sometimes progress, they'd go in teams of 2s and 3s and work for a few hours, and then the other guys would relieve them. So they did it night after night after night. And just like the movie Great Escape, they would put dirt in their pants and walk around and put in the flower gardens. They had vegetable gardens and things like that, and disperse the dirt that way, or they'd flush it down toilets, things like that. Okay, let me just skip that. Okay, that was the #1 song on the hit parade the night they escaped, so I just put that in. And also a movie playing in Phoenix was U-Boat Prisoner, which was true too, which was kind of funny. Okay, so they dug for 4 months. Well, here's another funny story, and let's see if I have it here. Okay, that's the hole they dug, okay? And that wasn't discovered because they would put a coal box over top of it, so they didn't discover that through 2 or 3 days later. I have a clip here. I'm a little bit, okay, there's a tunnel. You probably can't see it, but just know that it's 178 feet, about 6 foot down, straight across, 178 foot, through caliche. Very hard. They did it. Don't want to go there. I guess I don't. There it is. Okay. I had a clip. I wanted to describe it to you. So they would notice on Sundays, when the day off that the American Guards would go play baseball. Okay, American pastime at that time, very popular. And so they said to the American prison officials, we would like to play a game called Faustball, F-O-U, which is fistball. I never heard of it, but you can look it up on YouTube. They still play it today. Where it's kind of like volleyball, but the ball hits the ground and then bounces. I just had a clip of it. But here's the funny thing about it is it requires a very large field. Okay, so that was the point of that. So the Americans go, yeah, that would be good for prisoner morale. And here's some extra rakes and shovels to help you create your field. So they did. So they had extra rakes and shovels, for sure. So they would dig it. But here's the funny thing was they would have piles of dirt on the field at night, okay, because they were leveling the ground, making sure it was perfect. And then every night they level these piles off and refill them with new dirt that they had dug from the tunnel, and the Americans never caught on. So that's how they figured out how to get rid of all the dirt. So in December, so they had dug it by December, probably early December, they had figured out that it was done. So they had to figure out how we're going to get out of there. So they there was a telephone pole like outside the fence, that was surrounded by bushes, so they aimed for that. So very genius, actually. And then they dug up, and then they had a pole, and they stuck a flag through it, and they waved it just enough so that a person standing on the roof of the barracks could see it, and then they lowered it so they knew they were there. So they found the hole. So they didn't expose it yet, but they knew they got their exit. So they waited for the right time, and then they heard on the radio about the Battle of the Bulge and things like that. So it's unknown really whether the whole camp was in on it. My guess is that they were. So they had a disruption. So these guys got out. So I'll just tell you briefly some stories of what happened to the guys that got out, and then we'll be done. So they went teams of 2s or 3s. Okay, I'll show you some of the pictures of the guys. Let's see. Let me see if I can find it. There you go. Okay. Some of them pretty hardcore looking guys. Especially that guy, Captain Wilhelm Gunther. I would think a big blow up of his face would be good cover for the book, a book, you know, because he looks pretty sinister. So they left in 2s and 3s. Okay, here's a real good story. Well, 3 of the guys had built a boat. This is how lax security was. They actually constructed a boat of canvas and wood, and they would hide it in the bathroom rafters, and the Americans never caught on. And so they had sectioned it in 3 pieces. And so the tunnel was only like 36 inches. It was very, you know, just enough to, but they did get a boat, and they did sneak it through the tunnel, and they got out, and they had seen a map where the Gila River had blue in it. And so they're going, we're going to put this in the Blue River, and then we're going to sail to Colorado, and then down to Mexico. That was the plan. Well, here's a funny story about history, is that it was such a rainy year that year that when they did they got it out. They took it up. You can imagine getting that thing, 3 of them. Each man carried one. They called it 3 crazy boatmen. That's what they called themselves. And they got it to the Gila River. And it actually did have water in it. So they could have floated. But here's a funny story, was that it had rained so much that the wood joints of the boat had swelled up, and so they couldn't be connected. So they had to wait for it to dry out a little bit so they could connect the joints to put the 3 pieces together. And so they hid out on an island with bushes and waited. And as they waited, the water went down. They waited another day, it went down. Finally, they put it together, they put it in the water, and it just hit the bottom. And they all cried. That's what they said years later. They all cried, because all that work. So then they walked it. So they walked along the Gila, and they were captured by washing, believe it or not, washing their underwear in an irrigation ditch. They were captured. Because it became one of the largest manhunts. Once they figured out that they were on the loose, it became one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history at that time. I don't know if for all time or not, but at that time it was. So these guys went to the Gila River, and then they were caught. And here's another good story. Well, they were offered a reward, the American public, because they put $25 to capture them, $15 if you spotted them and then called the authorities. So $25 at that time was like $400 today. So that's a lot of good, and a lot of Native Americans, trackers went after them, and the Native Americans captured these guys, because along the Gila River was, I think, the reservation at that time. So probably still today. So that's who captured them. Okay, so that's that two. So 2 officers, they all split up there. They all went different ways. Okay, so some of them, 6 of them gave themselves up almost immediately. It was cold, rainy, and so they just surrendered. In fact, 2 of them surrendered almost before they had realized that people had escaped. So, because they didn't really realize till 4 p.m. The next day that people had even escaped. So, another 2 officers, U-boat officers, went to Casa Grande area, so they went down that way, okay? And so one of the guys, so you can imagine hiking, I was driving through this desert, I was just trying to imagine walking through it. And because they had to travel at night, a lot of them, so they're traveling in the winter, at night, through desert, Sonoran Desert. These guys grew up in Germany. Grass, meadows, forest. They're not used to cholla. Well, this one guy stepped on a cholla and it went through his foot, and he cut him, and he got infected. So they got as far as Casa Grande. So they went to a farmhouse. The dog was barking, and there was 3 children alone, and a babysitter from Coolidge High School, who during the Christmas break was earning extra money by babysitting. So he said the dog was barking. He saw these 2 men walking towards him. And what was a funny story is the parents had gone to Phoenix because they were doing errands for that day. And it was on the radio that the people had escaped. And the last words from their mother was, "Don't let anybody in the house, especially Nazis." That's what I included as a title for a chapter, if you do a chapter. So they knocked on the door. So the kid, he was scared to death. He knew who they were, I'm sure he did. And so one of the Germans could speak English, so he said, "Can we, my aunt's hurt, can we come in?" He couldn't walk any further. So they came in, and they just wanted to wait for the parents. They learned that the parents weren't there. They just wanted to go back. And so they waited all day long, and the parents did not come home until that night. And he told them stories of his own children, and also gave them chocolate. So I think that was a good story. So that was, they were the first officers captured. Okay, two other guys went sort of like a southwestern direction, and they were captured in Covered Wells, Arizona, which is at that time the Papago Park. Papago Indian is gone all now, but here's their story. So they got out and they were hiking, and they went in the daytime, going through the desert. And a week later they ran out of water, and luckily it rained, so they found water in puddles on rocks. And later testimony is they said they drank it and it tasted like champagne. I always remember that. And so they were in the reservation area, and they found a jackrabbit which had been run over. So they cooked it and ate it. So they were hungry. So this is testimony from these guys. And then they were about to go to sleep, and they grew up with Western movies. The Germans love wild Western movies. So just at twilight, a herd of horses came running towards them. Can you imagine? So they all stood up and just were wide-eyed looking at it, and the horses went, split up and went by them. But it said the guy testified that their eyes were glowing red. So you can just imagine the visual of that, the horses going by them. So they were tired, so they went back, fell asleep. They woke up, and they were surrounded by 15 Indians who had probably saw them, and so they captured them. Nobody had any guns, so they captured them, and they took them into town, the cells. And then they said, "Do you know how to play chess?" They asked the Germans, or one of them, I don't know, sign language was speaking, and they said, "Yeah, they did." So they had a crippled boy in that reservation who knew how to play chess, but nobody else did. And so he wanted to play chess, so the Germans played chess with him. And so they played chess, and they called the army officials, and the army officials came out from Tucson. And this shows the humanity of Americans and Germans at this time, probably for all time. But so the Germans, they're probably young men. I don't really know their ages, but I'm guessing they're young men. It's Christmas time. They're lonely. They're thinking of Christmas. It's where the Christmas tree originated. So they said to the army officials, "We're going to drive them to to Phoenix, back to Papago Park," but it was too far, so they wanted to spend the night. So they asked the German Americans, "Could you drive us through the towns? We want to see people, and we want to see Christmas lights." And so they did. So they drove. I just imagine that scene of going through and what they were looking at and seeing people laughing and things like that. And you can imagine these two young guys, probably in their mid-20s, just seeing Christmas lights and just thinking of their own memories and wanting to be home. But they did do that, and so I thought that was a very good story, the humanity of those guys. Okay, so the last story is, I showed you, let's see. Well, they were saying they had thousands of leads and things like that, and bloodhounds, and I think the Civil Air Patrol in Arizona actually was looking for them. And they would find a jacket on a train, and then they'd call in. Or another time, they heard people talking a strange language, so they would call up. And so you can see, it's kind of funny. This is a search party, but look at the clouds. So it was a rainy year that year. So even during the search, but it was a large manhunt. Okay, so this last story. And so this is the last guy to be captured, and he was the leader, Captain Europe, and they called him the Super Nazi, actually. And so, he went with 3 other guys, and so where everybody else went south, he went north. Smart. So he was counterintuitive. And so they hung out, and they were the last to be captured. So 35 days later, he was the last to be captured. So here's what happened to the other 2. The one guy that he was with got tired of foraging for food, and they would actually sneak into Phoenix and raid dumpsters and things like that. They actually had a little bit of money, and one time they went into a bar and had beers. Another time they went to a bowling alley and just watched people bowl, so I thought that was pretty interesting. And so, but he snuck back into the camp. He went to a work detail so he could eat good. But that's how lax the security was of Americans. And so he got on a work detail and snuck in. And there was a guy missing, so they knew it. So he took his name, but they discovered him. So that's how they captured him. Another guy they saw on McDowell Road, because the German work details would also stick food in different places, like under bushes. And so they saw this one guy looking like under bushes for something, so someone called on him. So they captured him. Okay, so this guy, last guy, the leader, actually, number one. So he said he has to get out of here. So they hid in a cave, and I guess it's called Piestewa Peak. It was called Squirrel Peak at that time. There's a cave that's still there today, I think. I'm sure it is. So they hid in this cave, and then so they would sneak into Phoenix at night and forage and things like that. Well, he snuck into the Adams Hotel. He could speak English, but with an accent, and he slept in the lobby, and then he had Chinese food, and then he probably had a beer or two, and then he was going to hop a freight train. So it was getting late at night, so he went and he asked the street sweeper, street cleaner, he goes, where's the freight yard at? Because he was going to hop a train just to go anywhere. Well, the guy recognized that he had a German accent, and so he called on him, and so he captured him. So that's how he was captured. Okay, so that's the end of the story. I'll just say, so 1985, they did a commemoration of this event, this park, and they put a plaque, and 9 of the POWs, 3 of the guys who escaped came back, so I thought that was pretty interesting. Another thing was that when they captured them, here's how Americans treated prisoners compared to how Germans might have treated prisoners. They got all the prisoners together, they grouped them together, and then a truck drove by with caskets on it, accidentally, and they all thought they were going to get shot. And then the Americans sentenced them to bread and water for 16 days, and they all burst out laughing. And the Americans were going, what are you guys laughing about? And that was why they were laughing, because they thought they were going to get shot. Because the Great Escape in, if you've ever seen that movie, they shot 50 of those guys. But here's a true story, is that they didn't shoot them in a field like the movie portrays. It was actually more sinister. They interviewed them 2 at a time, and then they removed them, and then they quietly shot them. So that's how they shot like 50 of them. So we didn't do that. And so that's the difference between how we treated POWs and maybe how Germans did. That's it. That's the end of the story. Thank you for coming. I'll take any questions. You guys have any questions?
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
The first question is,
So who captured them? Was there a deal where like British people caught them and then handed them over to the Americans, or were these solely
Good
captured
question.
by
I
Americans?
think they were captured like at sea. So they were captured at sea, and I don't really know. I think the British did capture a lot of them, and the Americans probably captured some of them, but I'm guessing mostly British. British were very, very good at naval warfare.
And my other question is, you didn't honestly like give them money to go home with at the end, did you? Because they earned money as they went along.
You know how
so did they get to take?
You know how they earned money? This guy was wearing a yellow Sears shirt. You know how they earned money? This is a funny story. They would make iron crosses and eagles, you know, the Nazi symbols, out of toothpaste in the camp. Well, they did their picking of the cotton. It earned any sense, but they earned extra money by selling to American service GIs fake Nazi replica stuff. So they would make swastikas and stuff.
But
and
they
then
were
hide
allowed
them
to
in the
leave the
sun.
country with it at the end of the war?
At the end of the war,
They could take the money with them?
they probably didn't make that much.
Okay.
Yeah, they were allowed to take, I think, a duffel bag. And they went back in 1946.
I thought it was really fascinating. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you. Yeah, I think this gentleman had a question. I think they want the microphone.
I live in Delaware while my son and family still. Where'd you grow up in Delaware?
Wilmington, Delaware, northern,
Plymouth?
around there.
Okay.
Did you know Joe Biden?
Yeah.
I won't go there.
I live in Hocus.
Oh, I know where, 5 miles from Hocus. Right on. Any other questions?
Not really a question.
Sure.
I was raised in Roswell, New Mexico. They had a large prison of war camp there. after the war, they called it Orchard Park. And it was kind of low-cost housing for people. And my wife and I went out there to babysit some friends' kids. But farmers in the area use them, like you said, in the agriculture, cotton and all of that.
Yeah.
And many of them returned after they were sent to Germany. They returned and became citizens of the United States.
You know what, I don't want to devalue what you're saying, but almost every time I give this talk, someone says, I know a German who came back. I guess they had so much propaganda, and then when they first were introduced to American life and lifestyle, that's a very common thing. Yeah.
They had Walker Air Force Base. They had built it for B-29s. My mother and father were members of the CAP, and a lot of the planes coming in were coming in to be repaired, and some of them didn't make it, and they would go out on search missions to find the downed airplanes.
Wow. Wow.
So I grew up in the war area.
Wow.
Very patriotic.
Wow.
My mother would take us to the front of the house to a flagpole, and we would put up the American flag every morning
Wow.
and say a Pledge of Allegiance.
Wow. Yeah, that's probably the most united our country has ever been, actually.
Yes,
Yeah, I would
but
agree.
I enjoyed your
Thank you very much.
presentation here.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? If not, really appreciate you guys having me. Thanks a lot.